What is up everyone and welcome back to another video. So as you probably know, W King is one of the most common strategies in all areas of Fortnite, from arena to tournament and even just regular pub stomping. So that's why in today's video I'll be going over everything that you need to know to W key like a pro in Fortnite Chapter 3 Season 3 and future seasons. I'll be going over every phase of the game and how to play it properly, as well as other general strategy tips along the way that'll help you to maximize your W key potential regardless of which game mode or type of game you're in. Before we get into it though, be sure to drop a like if this video helps you out, and consider subscribing as well if you want to see more content just like this in the future. And lastly, consider using code Teckoh in the item shop, as it's 100% free and it helps your boy out a ton. But with that said and without further ado, let's get into today's video. So starting off this video, we're going to begin with the early game. Early game is definitely the hardest portion of the game in my opinion, at least when it comes to W keying, as it really sets the stage for the entire rest of the game, but it can also involve a lot of struggle if you approach it wrong. So the first thing we'll want to figure out for your W key early game is going to be your early game strategy. The reason I put this before landing spots is because depending on which general strategy you go for, your landing spots are going to vary quite a bit. So there are two main strategies here that I recommend you try. The first one is going to be the all-out aggression strategy, basically meaning you land at the most popular spot possible, go for as many kills as possible, and if you die, you die. I guess that's kind of the strategy that most people commonly associate with W keying. This strategy tends to get the most overall kills on the good games, but it results in far more deaths off spawn, and it's less useful for tournament style gameplay where you actually lose something if you lose the game. On the other hand, you've got the delayed aggression strategy. This strategy involves landing either on the outskirts of the super populated spot and then looting up and rotating in, or it can also involve simply landing at a medium population spot and playing your game out as normal, and of course playing more aggressive as mid game comes along since you're all looted up. On one hand, the all-out strategy can bring a lot more early game kills, but you can end up with lackluster materials and HP. But the delayed aggression strategy will bring you less spawn kills, but a more consistent stream of materials, HP, and loot. So ultimately, this really just depends on your situation. I typically recommend that if you have absolutely nothing to lose and have no care in the world if you get eliminated, such as if you're playing public matches or you just don't care about losing arena points, then the all-out strategy is totally fine. But if you do have something to lose or you're simply not as confident with spawn fights, then the delayed aggression method can still work wonders. So once you've got your general strategy down, the next step to early game is to determine your landing spot. For W keying, the typical goals for a landing spot should be an appropriate population, materials, loot, and either good mobility or position near the middle of the map. The reason I mentioned the last point as being optional is that typically players rotate into the middle of the map, and hovering around that area is going to put you in the best spot for more eliminations later on. So while I can't give the exact spot for every situation, I'll give you a few general recommendations for each strategy. For the delayed aggression strategy, a few fantastic spots are Rocky Reels, Sanctuary, or Sleepy Sound. Another option is to land at something slightly outside of a popular POI if you want to get kitted, but you also want to get into the action early. I guess that's kind of like a mixture of the delayed aggression and all-out strategy. For the all-out aggression strategy, your typical W key spot should do the trick. The most obvious choice here is Tilted Towers for this strategy, but Coney Crossroads is also a pretty good one. And aside from that, typically the first drop or two off the bus can be a good option as well if you're trying to mix things up a bit. Moving on to our next section, and for this one we're going to be combining mid and end game. The reason I'm combining this section is because aside from scrims and tournaments, pretty much every regular game mode has no difference between mid game and end game, and games often end before the 5th zone even hits, at least in arena. So for mid game and end game, the general strategy that you're going to want to employ when W keying is simply to play the most popular side of zone, aka the areas the most players are rotating into, and then just push any reasonable fight you can get into. Obviously, if you're in shambles, then you shouldn't be W keying, but for the most part, the actual way to find fights is super simple. Aside from that, a big factor in mid game that I find a lot of players messing up on is how quickly they end fights. Oftentimes, I find people getting into fights but letting them drag on for a super long time, then getting third-partied and then losing because of it. Ending your fights as fast as possible is a super critical part of mid game, especially since it saves you a lot of time you could otherwise spend fighting and avoids you getting into a shambles third-party situation where your entire game goes down the drain. While it's definitely easier said than done, there are a couple of quick methods you can implement to hopefully end most of your fights faster. The first of these methods is to simply play the aggressor in every fight. If you're constantly putting pressure on your opponent and not letting them get away, they're basically going to have no choice aside from wasting all their materials trying to hide or taking the fight and hoping for the best. And when you're already in your opponent's head by playing aggressive, the odds are definitely in favor of you winning that fight. As well as that, another big tip I recommend is to learn piece control if you haven't already. One of the best ways to end fights quickly is to catch your opponent in a box and basically force them into a losing battle, and piece control is exactly the way to do that. While I can't go over piece control very thoroughly in this one video, I would recommend you check out one of the maps on screen, both of which I placed in my recent piece control guide. And you can also feel free to check out that video as well after this one if you want some more specific information about piece control. Moving on from that, the only other tip I have for mid and end game is simply going to be confidence. You'd really be surprised by how much confidence impacts your gameplay and your ability to fight in Fortnite, especially when you're simply going in and pushing every single fight you can find. I did cover confidence briefly in my last video, but the basic rundown is this. Confidence is pretty much the be-all end-all of fighting in Fortnite, and you really can't go without it. Improving your confidence in game is kind of complex, but I find that there are two strategies that work really well. The first is simply to force yourself into nerve-wracking situations. This means taking the situations that make you the most nervous, particularly when it comes to fighting, and simply doing them over and over until you basically become numb to them. It's pretty much like the exposure therapy they do for fears, except it's in Fortnite, which is a lot less terrifying than like spiders or heights or something like that, as you might expect. And the other method to improve confidence that I found to be super effective is simply to fake it until you make it. If you're nervous in a fight in Fortnite, chances are your opponent is just as nervous or maybe even more nervous than you are. But they don't see how you actually feel, they only see how you play. So if you play with absolute confidence, you maintain aggression and pressure, and then you act like there's nothing you're afraid of, your opponents are far more likely to crumble under the pressure and make it far easier for you to kill them, even if you're not really as confident as you seem to be. You can literally be a totally mediocre player and play super aggressive and super confident and destroy some pretty darn good players. And the beautiful thing about this is that pretending to be super confident will ultimately help you build confidence as you start to realize you're actually better at the game than you thought, and your mentality was what really held you back the most. Overall though, mid and end game are pretty simple nowadays for W keyers. Push fights with confidence, try to end them quickly, and repeat that until the last player is down. Obviously, this gets a lot more convoluted with tournaments and scrims, but chances are those are being played out as regular games rather than W key games, so I decided not to account for that since it doesn't apply to the vast majority of players, especially when it comes to W keying. Getting into our last bit of today's video though, and the last topic I want to discuss very briefly is practicing fighting. Improving your overall fighting skill is extremely helpful in allowing you to W key more successfully, and I typically recommend that you spend around 30 minutes practicing in creative for every hour that you spend in regular games. That is, if you're trying to maximize your W key potential. In order to improve fighting, you're pretty much going to want to spend time doing three things. Those are going to include mechanics, aim, and fight simulations. Mechanics can include anything from piece control maps, to edit courses, to practicing retakes, and other stuff like that. Aim is pretty much anything from aim duels to regular aim maps to even external aim trainers like Kovacs and Aim Beast. And lastly, fight simulations are pretty much anything that simulates a regular fight. These can range from zone wars to box fights, build fights, realistics, and so on. While I can't give you the perfect prescription as to how you should approach your creative practice to W key better, I will say that doing a reasonable mix of all of these things and also targeting them to your exact weaknesses should put you in a really good spot to improve your overall fighting and your W keying. Creative practice is super helpful when it comes to improving at W keying, so I'd recommend you put some solid time into it while also balancing your regular gameplay as well. But with all that said guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on how to W key like a pro in Fortnite Chapter 3 Season 3. Overall, by following all the tips in this video, you should be well on your way to the perfect W key strategy and improve your overall fighting abilities and skills in the process. Getting good at W keying is a pretty long process, but hopefully this video helped set you on the right track and put you in the best position to improve going forward. If this video helped you out, then be sure to drop a like on it, and consider subscribing as well if you want to see more content just like this in the future. As well as that, consider using code Teckoh in the Fortnite item shop as it's 100% free and it really helps your boy out a ton. With that said, thank you all for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.